tour. And what we're going to be looking at today is the other side of what the people who were just moving into this urban area were doing. So last week on the tour, we had, a lot of homes and whatnot where we had people moving into the area and establishing these urban spaces. And here we start to look at the buildings and the structures and the businesses that they started to create as they built this section of Maine. And we actually start this part of the tour with a fire that happened on June 21st and 22nd of 1889. This destroyed the old Catholic Church, which was actually still sitting on the Hudson's Bay property near the fort and had been abandoned for quite some time after the U.S. government had asked the Catholic Church to move off of the premises. But it also destroyed a significant section of the business district right down here in Vancouver. Now, the Independent read a headline. It said, "Vancouver scorched. Firebug gets their work in." The fire was the work of an arson, and they had set 2 fires on 2 nights in these different areas. And it was a massive loss to the business district area. It started between 3rd and Main, and the Oddfellows building, which was a brick building on the west side of Main, actually stopped the fire from progressing. But on the east side of Main, there was only wooden structures, and so the fire crew of Vancouver actually went on top of McMillan's butcher shop, and they stood where there was a 12-foot gap between the buildings, where there was an alley. And they stood their ground there at peril of the fire taking their feet out from under them and actually stopped the fire from progressing on that side. But unfortunately, a lot of the business district was decimated. Despite their efforts, the night destroyed the heart of this district. And in one night, the city lost stables, a restaurant, city hall, jail, laundry, shoemakers, homes, a bank, a hotel, 2 fish markets, a music store, and a whole lot of saloons. Vancouver had a lot of saloons back then. And so the town had to rebuild. And in the midst of that process, they actually had lost their city hall. And to kind of give you an idea of how the district looked at that time, to give you an idea of what they lost, the city hall, if we take a turn and look right out here to where that clover's at, you're looking at where City Hall originally stood in Vancouver, Washington. Now, this area of Maine used to stretch all the way down, and there's actually an account from archaeologist records that talks about that they were doing a dig when they had to do archaeological digs when they dug up this area to make the freeway, and they found one section that just had tons and tons of human teeth, and they were kind of wondering what that was all about. So they went and they looked at the records and the directories, and they realized that it was a dentist that was actually right at that location, and that he had just been pulling the teeth and then chucking them out the back door. And so the archaeological records supported that, and then you could see a little bit of what his trade was. Now, the first city hall that was lost in the fire, there's actually no known photos of this, but we do have an account of this one city hall. And it seems that maybe the city wasn't too broken up for the fact that this city hall was gone. Mayor Dr. J. Rudolph Smith wrote in the Vancouver Register on May 17th, 1888, "The fact of this city is in its present stagnant condition, maintaining a surplus is something extremely ludicrous. $2,500 in the treasury and the city hall and council chambers that are hardly fit for a barn and hayloft. The streets are as dark as Egypt, except where the citizens have erected lamps that cast a sickly light from coal oil burners, and no sewer as yet laid through the principal streets. Let the present City Hall property be sold and proceeds applied to the purchase of a suitable site for a building that would do the city credit." Well, he didn't have to worry about that because it burnt down. So that was taken care of. But at this point, the city had to begin rebuilding. And so it began to establish new buildings. And actually Ken here can talk about a building that was established by the mayor that came during the time of the fire, Louis Soames. He was the mayor and actually established a building that now is a vacant lot.
Across the street here, there is a...
You want to come in closer?
Yeah, across the street, there is a vacant lot. And on the north end of this vacant lot stood the Soames building. The Soames building had businesses in it, and attached to the Soames building,
traffic, airplanes.
we get a lot of competition. But attached to the Soanes building was the First National Bank of Vancouver. Now the president of the bank was Charles Brown, and his head cashier was Edmund Canby. And head cashier at that time was a very important position in a bank. Well, in 1893, there was a financial collapse, particularly here in Vancouver and here in the West, and the bank gave out some bad loans, one of the biggest being to Michigan Lumber, which was down here along the river. Well, to protect his reputation, to protect the bank, both Brown and Canby cooked the books. They altered the entries. And in 1901, there was a bank examiner that came in, shades of It's a Wonderful Life, but there was a bank examiner that came in, and he discovered the errors. Well, Brown and Canby knew they were in deep. So they went home. There was a big ruckus. They went home. They wrote suicide notes, and they walked up to what is now the corner of 39th and Kaufman. It was just an open field then. Canby took a pistol, shot himself, dead. Then Brown picked up the pistol, shot himself, and come to find out that it wasn't as bad as they had first determined. The people did get back about 50 cents on the dollar of their investments. And that was the sad story of this particular block here. Later, in the Soanes building, there was a facade put over it. Some of the old timers might remember the Frontier Room. Frontier Room was a bar, had a nice nightclub in it. One time in the early 60s, one of the Crosby boys was performing here. And of course, they didn't have the stature of their father, Bing. At the same time, over in Portland, I believe it was at the Coliseum, Bob Hope was performing. And Bob Hope and Bing Crosby had a great relationship. So after his show in Portland, Bob Hope came over here into the Frontier Room and did a cameo performance with Crosby's son.
So yeah, so a pretty lively history about that area there. And you know, he's talking about the Frontier Room, a bar, and so we actually take a look at this building right here to see one of the finest hotels that were built around this area in the early 20th century. And this building was built in 1928, and the Evergreen Hotel came to being in the mid-1920s. See, Vancouver residents were concerned about the lack of a high-quality space for visitors and social gatherings. So in 1927, the Chamber of Commerce began a drive for a new hotel, which would be financed by community contributors. And the American Security Bank developed a plan, and about 435 people bought shares in the Vancouver Community Hotel. And in March 1928, the new hotel was opened to great fanfare, and it was a strategic site at this junction, which used to be the east-west junction, north-south for it. So this street used to be what would take the city east and west and north and south. So it was a critical junction in the city. It was quoted that it was livered footmen were on hand to open the door, and there were 250 pleased guests who sat down before a new dazzled linen, new silver glassware, and new china bearing the Evergreen monogram, while flags and flowers decorated the premise. The opening of the hotel coincided a gala celebration of the activation of the electric lighting in downtown Vancouver. So around the same time, they got all the electric lighting. And the Evergreen Hotel was the only hotel at this time between Portland and Olympia. And so it was a quite significant space. Over the next 30 years, the building functioned as a hotel, but it had a gradual decline, which actually first forced its condemnation in 1977, and it actually stood vacant for a time until a private developer began to rehabilitate it. And it housed restaurants, card rooms. In 1986, it became a retirement facility. And today now it's an assisted living home, and it remains one of the dominant features of the Vancouver skyline in this area. And this is in the Italian Renaissance style of building that we're looking at. So this building, if we take a look across the street, this is a longtime fixture in downtown, and this was Vancouver National Bank building, and it has housed many important financial institutions in Vancouver. It's actually said to have been designed by Oliver Hidden of the Hidden family. And he actually is talked about a lot in different architecture around the city. So he was pretty prolific in that. And this was built in 1906 as the Citizens Bank of Vancouver, and the business consolidated to the Vancouver National Bank. And the owners of the bank paid about $20,000 for this property, and they had the reputation for being solid, but development problems happened during the Depression, and so there were issues with the bank. But like other nationwide banks, this bank was actually bailed out by Roosevelt in '33. And this was the first federal savings and loan, probably the last financial institution to occupy this building. Actually closed its doors in 1953, and now it's occupied by the Firehouse Glass. And so from here, we'll go ahead and walk up the street to the next building.
Go ahead.
So Ken is actually speaking with the person who runs this place down here, and we'll actually get to take a look down here. But while we're standing here, I'll talk about this building, which was originally the U.S. National Bank. And it was organized in 1910 by Lowell M. Hidden, which you can still see his house up on 13th and Main, and J.M. Langsdorff, which actually his home is still standing over in the Esther Short neighborhood. And in 1912, they had the bank building constructed, and it would be Vancouver's fifth bank.
Yeah, well, they can bring them all at one time.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a look down here, and Ken will tell you a few stories about this basement.
If there's anybody that can't handle steps, we'll try to fill you in as best we can because we have no handicap access. The building is owned by Dean Irvin, and I've had the opportunity to talk to Dean on a number of occasions about his buildings. He owns a number of historic buildings around Vancouver. He owns this building. He owns the first federal savings and loan building, among others. This building has got some rich history. Is it about 1905?
About 1910.
Yeah, somewhere in that vicinity. Yeah, okay. And there was the Palace Theater above us. And here in the basement, there was a billiard room, and there was a barber shop down here. Also sharing the building for many years was Sparks Hardware Store. And so we're going to learn more about Sparks today as the day goes on. But Sparks is the oldest family-owned business in Vancouver. Runyon will tell you that they have the oldest family-run business in Vancouver that has stuck with the same product, jewelry.
Yeah, because you still can't purchase a tin trough from Sparks.
Yeah. So Sparks,
even though I need one.
Yeah, Sparks is up on Broadway and Evergreen. Now this space is really interesting because it's a long, narrow space. And Dean tells a story about when he was a kid, they had slot car tracks in here. And the room wasn't quite as well lit. And they would start at this end of the building and race their slot cars clear to the other end and hear them go off the track but not be able to see them. So it's a really interesting building. It is an old building. There's been a number of tenants. Today, where the old theater was, there's Sunday services, pretty lively services. I've walked down by here on Sundays, and it's jumping in there. And there's an internet cafe above us. And the other interesting thing about this building is at the very end of this building, there's a tunnel that leads somewhere. It's been blocked off, but the tunnel is just fascinating. I've done a lot of research on the tunnel. I think I have the answer.
Yeah. And this building was built by two-time council member Christian Engelman, and he was actually a theater owner too. He owned the theater up above. And this location, like Ken said, once housed the Palace Theater and the New Palace Billiards, along with boxing matches in the basement. So they also did boxing matches in the basement area too here. And then the Oyster Loaf restaurant also occupied this location. And so from here, we'll go and head out, and we'll start walking back up the street. So if we want to turn around, we'll take a look at the Schofield building here. And as early as 1886, Edward Schofield was listed as selling cigars on Main Street between 6th and 7th. And his residence was at the same location. And in 1889, Edward Schofield was at this location, as well as Nicholas Schofield, who had a general merchandise store. And so this is one of the older buildings. This is built anywhere around 1900 to 1906. It's a little difficult to pin down the date on that one. And the Schofield block consists of 3 buildings, all built by Edward R. and Mary Elizabeth Schofield. And this property is part of the original Amos and Esther Short claim that we had talked about last week. And it's the oldest block, 600 Main, and it's a 2-story stucco-covered brick building on one side. And this building has been highly altered. On the second floor, displays traits of the Italianate style. And directly north of the 1906 building is 602 and 606 Main, and the facade is composed of a classic element based on traditional established École Beaux Arts. And many businesses have been located here. A.C. Chumacero's drugstore, James Padden's clothing store, H. Clausen's confectionery, a shoe store, and we actually pointed out that Chumacero had his home up at 11th and Main, where Kiggins is at today. Other tenants have included Zapp's Pharmacy in the 1940s, and today the building tenant includes the Top Shelf, the Cameo, Main Street Loans, and the Magenta Theater. And early part of the 20th century, the second floor was leased to offices and primary attorneys, and the second floor is now vacant except for the Schofield offices, which are still up in that location. And so from here, we'll go ahead and walk up to our next site.
Okay, this building here, it's not a part of our tour as such, but it's kind of interesting. It's got an interesting background. There's a deli in this building now and a second-hand store, but this has been the home of so many businesses. A lot of you are familiar with Cronus Tavern up the street. Well, this is where he started. He was here for years, but prior to that, in the late 40s and early 50s, the State Theater was here. Can you imagine a theater in this little building? And early on, it actually was first built for a grocery store. Safeway was one of the tenants at one time, and Safeway had about 10 stores up and down Main Street here in Vancouver. One time they were...
At the same time.
Yeah, not at the same time. One time they were in that orange building over there. So they've been all over town, but just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and actually on next week's tour, we'll see a couple more sites where Safeway used to be at. Oh, sorry.
We're going to go into the main entrance of the Eagles.
Yep, so from here, we're actually going to get to go into the Eagles building.
Well, now this isn't a part of our regular tour. You're getting the gold tour today. This building was built in 1912. And the people that built it were the Sparks family. Remember hearing about Sparks? Well, this was built as their first furniture store, 1912. They also had a business next door. They got into the automotive business at one time too. But this was their furniture store before they moved up to where they're at right now. Remember I talked about the tunnel? If you'd like to see where the other end of the tunnel is, we get an opportunity to see it in this building. Now you can put the connection together that there was a tunnel that was built between the 605 building and this building at 107 West 7th, so people and material could move back and forth between the two businesses. We thought there was something real sinister about these tunnels, but as it turns out, it was just a very practical thing to have a way for people to move from one family-owned business to the other. So if anybody would like to see it, we have our friend Bob down here who'll show us that in groups of about half a dozen. So.
We want you to be sure to tell us about every pub around those.
Yeah.
Counting on you.
I know a lot about those pubs.
We can tell you're speaking from experience.
So yeah, it was very interesting kind of understanding how this block was interconnected and how these early businesses, transported their goods or employees from one place to another. And these are just the kind of things, you just, you never know until you ask and you find out. So from here, we're going to go ahead and walk up and we'll take a look at this really beautiful building here right on the corner. Oh, sorry. But Sparks started as a general store. And so they sold lots of different goods, tin troughs and all kinds of things. And that was, the early days of how that was like. This building was constructed by Frank Eichenlaub, and who was partners with George Weigel in a clothing store. And he purchased the interest in the store in 1895 and kept the joint name. And a successful businessman, he was on the city council, and he helped found the club, which later merged with the Vancouver Athletic Club. And Eichenlaub was an interesting figure because there's actually, I saw a bit of a report that at the Vancouver High School graduation, he actually sang a duet. So he was not just a councilman and a business owner, but he also had some musical talent. And Ken actually knows a little bit about this building too.
Yeah, this building later, it's had a number of tenants. You'll see in the sidewalk, Reader's, a big Reader's sign in there. Well, in the 40s and 50s, Reader's Drugstore was here. Also, in this building, after Eichenlob, Charles Blue Rock had a meat shop in here. And it was interesting about meat shops here in Vancouver. In 1858, there was a city ordinance passed that no business could be open on Sunday except for meat markets. And they could stay open until 9 a.m. Well, Blue Rock, he was a famous meat market owner. He had several shops around town over the years. Across the street, that empty lot there on the corner was Runyon's jewelry store. And it was there for, beginning in 1928, I believe, for decades. Next to it was a bar called the White Elephant. Now, the White Elephant was the favorite bar for the shipyard workers in World War II. So it was a hopping place. Somebody here on the tour said, "You seem to know a lot about bars. You must do a lot of homework." So I have been doing my homework, and there's some great stories here.
Yep. And we're going to go and walk up and we'll take a look at a local favorite store for many years, the CC store.
This building over here says 704. For you who've been around a while, remember the Jade Palace? Yep. That's where it was. The G family owned the Jade Palace.
So this building was built around 1920, and this was originally the CC store. How many people remember the CC store in the community? And does anyone remember the interesting method in which you could pay at the CC store? Yes. So they had a box that they would put the cash in, and then they would have a line that would go back to the people in the back. And so it was a very interesting store. And this was actually found by Walter E. Carter and his sister Sally Carter, hence the CC store. Carter and Carter was the name. And Lloyd Garrison began working at the store in the 1920s, and he later owned it for many years. And the store actually operated until the 1980s and continued to be used as antique and vintage equipment and merchandise until it closed. And like I said, many people remember the sales receipts in the little wooden carriers that would be sent to the mezzanine via wire cables at this store. And this is a beautiful example of Art Deco style when we actually look at the style of the building here, because it has the little zigzags at the top and then the centerpiece that we have right there in the center of the building.
This is where you went to buy your 501 button fly Levi's and where you bought your Boy Scout uniforms.
Yeah.
This was the official place.
So from here we'll go ahead and head up and we'll take a look up the street. Yeah, this building is interesting architecturally. This was originally designed as a bank, and this was designed by a prominent Vancouver architect, Donald Stewart. And Stewart actually designed the Houck School, which you see up in the Houck neighborhood. And he was actually a modern, postmodern style architect. But in this time, when he was building this around 41, he actually did an Art Deco style like we see next door to have this nice sleek look. And this was a bank for many, many years. And you can actually, if you go around back, you can still see the area where you could drive up to the bank in the back. But this was taken over by Albina Fuel in the early 2000s. And this company has been owned by the same family, I believe, since 1903. And they've had several different generations of family members. And they were actually in Portland for their headquarters for most of their history. But then in the early 2000s, they decided to move over here into this wonderful and lovely building.
And this was the National Bank of Commerce when it opened. This is where I had my very first checking account.
So we'll go ahead and walk up here and we'll take a look up further the block. Okay, so remember how Ken pointed out the State Theater lower down on Lower Main? See, during this, in this area, we had a lot of theaters, and this was actually the USA Theater at one time, and it had vaudeville acts and all kinds of different things going on in there. And now it was most recently been Spanky's, but the building just down next to it was actually the Kiggins building.
Yep. Yeah, Kiggins actually had, if you look from here, you can see 3 of his buildings. That building used to say Kiggins on the side of it. This building still does, 1922. And of course, Kiggins Theater up the street. I might point out as well, Dean Irvin, I talked about him earlier, he also owns that building there on the corner of Washington and 8th, this is 8th or 9th. And that was called the Rank Building. Glenn Rank, an early political leader in Vancouver, built that building, and it's been around since the early 1900s.
And Rank had a shop. He did wagons and different things like that. And the interesting thing is, in our archive one day we were looking for information because we're doing an upcoming labor exhibit, and we were trying to figure out, you know, Rank's relation, because the Rank building was actually a labor temple for a period. But we actually found a correspondence between Rank and Henry Weinhardt. Now, Henry Weinhardt had a brewery in Vancouver, and it was just a general correspondence. And Weinhardt had taken Rank's letter and had responded in it and then sent the same letter back, obviously being frugal and not even wanting to waste any paper or anything. So that was a really interesting find, and that connects to the local political figure of Glenn Rank there. Now, if we look over here, we have a place that many people will remember as Melvin's store. And this building was it's looked at to be built around 1928. And although this is now Comfort's Interior, it was Vancouver's most longtime resident in this building was remembered as Melvin's Men's Shop. And the owner, Melvin Shavok, the shop opened in 1939 and continued on for 50 years. And it was a staple of downtown, specializing in men's formal wear. And originally, Melvin's operated just out of a small portion of the building, but over the years, Melvin purchased more and more space as tenants moved out. And by the 1960s, the main tenant in this whole building was Melvin's. One of the other tenants was Wolf's Radio and Electric, owned by Morris Wolf and Wolf Supply Company. And the Wolf Supply Company still has other locations in the area today. And in 1919, Morris Wolf began operating a service station across at Main Street. And at his business, he grew and diversified. And in 1932, he moved into this building. And Mr. Wolf remembers just how, after 4 months of moving in there was a terrible fire that took the entire block. And how he quickly thought, after this had happened, that he went across the street and set up his business again and was able to reopen just a few days later. Now, Ken has some memories about.
Oh yeah, I talked to Melvin one time. When I was in high school, I used to buy my clothes there, and he was bragging about the fact that he had a lot more basement space than he had store space. He said he had the largest inventory of men's clothing of anybody in Vancouver.
And in Melvin's, if we looked at the basement, like Ken was mentioning the basement, if you look down in the basement, it used to be a place where people would go and work, and it was a lot of women employees that would go down there and they would work with the clothing and different items. And there's actually remnants when you look in the basement of what looks like to used to be a child care. There's a little room in there with murals, and it has different children's names and different things drawn on there. And so it's a really interesting piece of the history that's left that no one seems to fully remember, but it shows evidence that that was there. And here we'll go ahead and take a look at the Elks Building, our last site for today. Okay, and so here we'll stop for today, and we'll take a look across the street here at this beautiful Italianate Spanish Mission building. And the reason for that, if you look, is that it has this nice Italianate facade with the different polychromatic brickwork there, but then it also has the shingles on that side of the roof have a Spanish Mission style, and then the curves on the corner also represent that style. So it's a mixture of two different styles. And this was the Elks Building, and it was built in 1911, and it's the only structure from a fraternal order during this period that still stands from this area in this space that was built by them. It's well maintained, and it still has much of its original detailing. The architect was Robert Teagan, and we actually know very little about him at all. But over the years, many political and civic leaders belonged to the Elks, and they continued into the 1930s after the Rotary took over as the most prestigious fraternal organization in the community. And the Elks sponsored social events. They had Christmas dinners, dances, and all kinds of charity events up on their second floor. And they remained in this building until 1973, when they finally moved to their other location, which is now in East Vancouver. And so with this, you see that, you know, in the community, you had these individuals that now they're not just, you know, subsisting, they're not just getting their farms and their businesses, but they're starting to develop community and fraternal organizations. And they're starting to establish really the core of the city. And so for next week's tour, we actually will be going up and seeing a part that grew a little bit later than the rest of the city, and that had some explosion in the early time, and we'll see the site of the first Uptown Theater. Yep, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you.